So today we're going to talk about equine parasite control and prevention. And I've given this talk many times, and most of the time we spend a bit of time talking about the science behind parasite life cycle biology and scientific terminology and that sort of thing. But today we're going to change tracks just a little bit, and we're going to jump in and jump right to what the horse owner or the horse customer really needs to know about parasite control in the horse world. What they don't need to know is a lot about life cycles and that sort of thing, but they do need to know a few basic points that are going to help them through controlling parasites in their horses. So, what does the horse customer really need to know about deworming their horse? So think about that for a few minutes. What couple basic things do they need to know, or are they going to ask you about deworming their horse? So, a couple things that we have listed here is, one of the most important things they're going to want to know is, do I need to deworm a horse at all? And if so, when do I need to deworm my horse? What should I deworm my horse with? How often should I deworm my horse? So that's a lot about the dewormers, the chemical dewormers. Should I do it now? How often should I do it? What should I use? And then lastly, on a separate course, how else can I control parasites on my farm and in my pastures beyond just chemical deworming? So those are some of the topics that we're going to cover today in this presentation. So, first parasite we're going to talk about, and the main parasite we're going to talk about, is small strongyles. And the reason for that is small strongyles are the most important parasite that we deal with in the United States. Many years ago, large strongyles were the most important parasite that we dealt with, and that was the basis for all the historical parasite control programs. The big shift these days is that we're now dealing with a completely different species that is really susceptible to resistance and really needs to be attacked completely differently than some of the old parasite control programs that were designed specifically for large strongyles. So what do we need to know about small strongyles? Well, there's multiple species of small strongyles. They create resistance very easily. They like to burrow into the intestinal lining in the horse's intestines. They may or may not become dormant for a number of months as they burrow into the intestinal lining and then come out of the lining and begin to shed eggs. Now, in low numbers, these parasites cause no problems to the horse at all. So, many horses can carry these parasites, and that's a completely normal phenomenon for many horses. However, in moderate and high numbers, we start to see problems with disease in the horse. And these problems may include colic, they may include ill thrift, they may include digestive upset, and they may include weight loss. And weight loss tends to be at the back end, so we can't really rely on weight loss to determine if a horse is infested with a large number of small strongyles. So what do small strongyles look like? Well, here's a nice gross picture, and we can't have a deworming talk with some nice gross pictures of horseworms. So small strongyles look like small little worms on fecal balls. And these small little worms will rarely show up like they do in this picture. This picture is an exception just to show you what they look like. But when we're looking at horses that are carrying high worm loads, we rarely see pictures that look like this, that have this many worms on an individual fecal ball. In fact, most horses that are carrying a moderate amount of parasites will show you no worms in their feces, and the only thing that will be present will be microscopic numbers of eggs in their feces. So let's back up a little bit and talk about some factors that relate to the horse, that relate to the farm that they live on, and that relate to the management of that horse. For this, I'm going to show a short video that shows a few of these factors together. When we talk about parasite management, there's a lot of things we need to consider from a farm perspective, and that, of course, always starts with the individual horse. So what are the different needs from a parasite management point of view between different horses? So here we have a younger, warm-blood show horse with no concurrent disease that's in good body condition. does this horse need to be dewormed any differently than horses that are older? And maybe horses that have different use, different age, and may have concurrent disease. For example here. Geriatric pony with Cushing's disease and chronic laminitis. So does this horse have different deworming needs than the young healthy horse? So one thing we can tell for sure is that just by looking at horses, we cannot tell about their different levels of resistance to horses, or resistance to parasites. Is the younger horse going to be a higher shedder or a lower shedder than the older horse? And the answer is, it is not dependent on age. However, there is one thing we do know, is that horses with Cushing's disease do tend to have higher egg counts. So this horse with Cushing's disease and chronic laminitis, on average, would be more likely to be a high shedder than the horse without Cushing's disease. But that is independent of age. Okay, we'll move from the barn situation to what we have on the pasture situation on a given farm. Here we are, end of January in North Carolina. We've got a little bit of snow on the ground, which is rare for us. This snow will be gone within a couple hours. We'll have horses grazing on these paddocks. So what effect do these paddocks have on parasite control? Well, stocking density, of course, is important. How much grazing, how close to the ground are horses grazing? Are there roughs and lawns in these paddocks? A little hard to tell with the snow, but these paddocks are very well managed. There are no roughs, there's no lawns that horses are eating in and around. And horses will be out here grazing all winter. Climate has a big effect on the amount of infective larvae on pasture. Here in the south, the wintertime is the worst time of year for horses to pick up infective larvae. As temperatures get above 85 degrees, parasite larvae die very quickly on pastures. So, in the south in the summer, horses are picking up very few parasites on pasture versus in the north. Year-round is a problem, and then, of course, this time of year in the south, they're picking up a lot of parasites. So, from a pasture management point of view, we can limit the number of horses per acre. Can we drag the pastures? We get that question all the time. Well, dragging's an interesting question. If we drag these paddocks in the middle of summer, when it's 85 degrees, and we keep the horses off these paddocks for a couple weeks, that does a great job of killing off the parasite larvae. If we drag these pastures during the middle of winter, we take the infective larvae and we spread them everywhere, all over the paddock, and the horses have no safe place to graze. So, not a good practice to be done when temperatures are cool. What else can we do for paddock management? Probably one of the most effective things we can do is to pick up feces, pick up manure on pastures. And if you look at these paddocks, okay, you see 0 piles of feces on them. And in fact, all the paddocks on these farms, on this particular farm, are managed in the same way. We have feces that is picked up twice a week on all the paddocks on this farm. In this particular farm, we've been doing this for about 15 years now. We've been doing fecal egg counts on a regular basis. And on this farm, we get 0 counts on every horse every time. And that includes horses of all ages, horses with Cushing's. We have 2 horses with Cushing's on this farm. And we consistently have low shedders across the board. So some of that is inherent to the horse, but a lot of it is inherent to the excellent management as well. Now on some farms, that management isn't possible. If we have massive pastures with high horse density, then the labor may be too intense to allow us to do that. But on smaller farms like that, which tends to be the trend these days in many areas, that is a possibility, and does a great job of parasite control, and can contribute greatly to the amount of times that we need to deworm those horses. So, factors to summarize what we just saw in the video, there's a few things concerning pasture management that are important. Pasture management is so important because that is where all the parasites are picked up by the horse. Okay? It's not in the stall situation, it is in the grazing situation. If you see the photograph on the right, there's a single water droplet that contains hundreds, if not thousands, of individual infective larvae. So this is where the horses are picking up the parasites. So if we can control the number of parasites they're picking up on pasture, identify those horses that are spreading most of the parasites, then we can accomplish most of our parasite control just with our pasture management through manure removal, dragging at times of the year when it's appropriate, managing stocking density, and that sort of thing. Additionally, if we consider climate as a role, especially in the southern United States where we have temperatures that regularly meet the cutoff requirement about 85 degrees or so, where small strongyle parasite eggs dry up and die very quickly on pasture, then we can use climate to our advantage. Years ago, we used to think that worms died off in the winter, especially in the south. But now we know the reverse is actually true, is that most horses will pick up greater parasite loads in the winter than they will in the summer. Then of course in the north, we're at a bit of a problem there because it really never gets hot enough to kill most of the parasites during the summer. The good thing about the north at least is there's less grazing going on during the winter, even though parasites can be a year-round problem. How do we determine which horses are carrying the most eggs, and how do we manage those horses on an individual farm? Well, everything comes down to fecal egg counts. And so you're going to hear me talk a lot about fecal egg counts, and I don't think we can overemphasize the importance of fecal egg counts to a parasite control program. In fact, they are the entire focus of our parasite management program. Okay? So fecal egg counts will categorize horses into one of three categories: either low shedders, or sometimes called low contaminators, moderate shedders, or high shedders. And this will completely dictate how often these horses need to be dewormed. So the horses that are the high and moderate shedders are going to need to be dewormed much more regularly. The horses that are low shedders may only need to be dewormed once or twice a year. The only way to know the category of these horses, as we mentioned in the video, is to do fecal egg counts. So fecal egg counts really do need to be considered part of the cost of owning and managing a healthy horse. Without them, we can't determine which horses are spreading the parasites on pasture. We can't determine and specify which horses need to be dewormed more often than others. We can't pick out those low shedders that don't need to be wormed very often, which is as important as identifying the high shedders. What happens if we deworm everybody too frequently? Well, what happens is we deworm a lot of horses that don't need to be dewormed at all. 80% of horses will be in the low shedding category and will not need routine deworming. 80% of horses can get by with deworming once or twice a year. And this has been proven in clinical studies on high stocking density farms in areas where there is a lot of parasite chemical resistance. And on these farms, if we just rely on fecal egg counts, we can reduce worm populations by 80% by doing nothing else. So back to the point that fecal egg counts are really important. The other negative part of deworming horses that have low egg counts, it's one of the best ways to create resistance. Okay. So if we're only deworming horses that have moderate or high egg counts, the development of resistance is drastically slowed. But when we start deworming horses with low egg counts, then our incidence of resistance goes up very quickly. I'm going to show a quick video here on the technique for doing fecal egg counts. We talk a lot about fecal egg counts, we stress the importance of fecal egg counts, so I wanted you to be able to see what the heck a fecal egg count procedure looks like. So here's a short video on that. So today we're going to talk about how to do fecal egg counts and the procedure behind that. So we start with a fresh sample of feces from the horse. And that can be a sample that's taken immediately after the horse defecates, or it can be kept in the fridge. in a sealed packet for up to 2 weeks. Strongyle eggs are easily kept in a fecal ball, in a sealed container, in refrigerated conditions. As remember, it takes conditions over the mid-80s before strongyle eggs will defecate. So, we are going to perform a McMaster's fecal egg count technique. We have pre-measured sugar solution that we use to measure, and then we are going to take 2 grams of feces, okay, and add them to our sugar solution. Okay. We'll add just a little bit more to make it 2 grams, so 1 fecal ball is more than enough to do a complete fecal egg count. Okay. We're going to mix this really well, and then we're going to strain it, okay, through a strainer into a nice Dixie cup. Okay. Once that has finished straining, then we'll have the solution that we're going to use to do our egg count. So I'm going to take a little bit of our fecal slurry, and we have a special McMaster's fecal egg count slide. So I'm going to take a little bit of our solution. We'll place it on the McMaster's slide until the slide is filled with solution. Then we're going to take a second sample so we can do a double check on ourselves and do 2 counts on the same slide. And notice that this slide has a grid pattern, which allows us to count strongyle eggs and to give an exact count on an eggs per gram basis, which is important for our monitoring program. Everything is done on an eggs per gram basis. So we're going to let this slide sit for 5 minutes, and then we can look at it under the microscope. So our slide, our McMaster's fecal egg count slide, is now set for 5 minutes. We're going to take it to the microscope. Okay. We're going to place it under the microscope, and then we're going to do a count grid by grid, use a multiplying factor, and decide how many eggs per gram that this particular horse has in its sample. Once we do that, and we have the full count, we can decide where we're going to assign that horse as a low shedder, a moderate shedder, or a high shedder. Or some people use the term low contaminator, moderate contaminator, or high contaminator, all based on the number of eggs per gram. That video shows how we perform, or how any individual lab might perform, a fecal egg count. And there's some slight variations in technique from lab to lab, but that's the basic technique that all labs use. Not too complicated, a little bit time consuming, but provides critical data when we're trying to determine the best way to deworm horses on a given farm. So when we're looking through the microscope, what do we see? If you look at the slide on the screen, you're going to see a picture of some strongyle eggs. And I'll give you a little hint about this. When we're looking at eggs like that, I can't tell, you can't tell, and nobody can tell if those are large strongyles or small strongyles. All we can tell is that they're strongyle eggs. Now the good news is that large strongyles have pretty much completely been eradicated from most farms in the United States. So that's good news. So we're going to assume, when we see high fecal egg counts, those eggs are coming from small strongyles and not from large strongyles, even though those eggs look very similar when we're looking at them through the microscope. So, fecal egg counts. How are we going to put them to use when we get our results on a given farm visit? So here in this slide we have a picture, okay, horse owner holding their horse, and we're going to discuss the fecal egg counts results with that horse and try to develop a deworming protocol for that specific horse. The deworming protocol will not be for the specific farm. We will not treat them as a herd. we will treat them as individual animals that all have their own individual inherent level of susceptibility to parasites. So what we'll want to do is do a fecal egg count. We'll want to do that fecal egg count a fair amount of time since the last deworming. And then we'll want to decide which dewormer to use. Well, we really only have 3 deworming categories that we use in horses. And if you look at the slide, we can look at those first 3 categories. The benzimidazoles. Okay, these include drugs like Anthalcide, Panacur, those Safeguard, those sorts of drugs. Now these drugs worked really good in the early days. Nowadays, these drugs in that drug category, and all of these drugs end in OLE. If you're trying to remember that, you don't need to remember the full term benzimidazole, but if it ends in OLE, it's a benzimidazole. And those drugs have a tremendous amount of resistance. In fact, in many farms, they don't work at all. And in farms where they do work, we may have their duration of action or their egg reappearance interval last only 2 to 4 weeks if they work at all. The second category we have on the screen is the pyrentals. And really there's just one dewormer that we use in horses that belongs to that category. That's pyrental. That's, everybody's heard of that. Strongid is the main drug you've heard about, or the main manufacturer's name for pyrental. Used both as a dose dewormer as well as a daily preventive wormer. Now, just like the benzimidazoles, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to the pyrental products to horses in the United States. So once again, they tend not to be very good for long-term use. Also, additionally, both of those dewormers will miss many of the non-small strongyle parasites that are much less important, but we don't want to forget about them together. And then you see the fourth drug that we have listed there is a drug called praziquantel. And that is kind of separate from the other drug categories in that it's used strictly to control tapeworms in horses. And tapeworms in horses are easy to control. If we deworm them once or twice a year, we will easily control tapeworm populations, which are relatively consistent throughout the United States. We covered most about what we need to know about deworming, but let's just go through a list of myths. And this list may seem sort of long, but believe me, this list could be 2 or 3 times longer than this. And I think most horse people today and most educated horse professionals sort of are on top of this. But let's just go through this one by one, make sure there's none of these, because these things that you believed, because these things are going to come up from horse owning customers that we run into. So let's take a look at this list. So first, rotation is useful. So rotation sounded like a great way to prevent resistance in horses. However, there is something that we learned about resistance when it comes to small strongyles. Resistance does not work. Great theory, worked tremendous for large strongyles, but is not useful, unfortunately, for small strongyle use. Secondly, older horses get more worms. For years and years, I was taught, okay, older horses need to be wormed more often. But that is not true. That only becomes true if that old horse happens to have Cushing's disease that suppresses their immune system and makes them more susceptible to parasites. So in general, the older the horse, doesn't really matter. They can be dewormed the same as those younger and middle-aged horses. What else? Horses should be dewormed at regular intervals. Well, once again, that is going to be completely dependent on the parasite burden of individual horses. 80% of horses, once or twice a year is fine. 20% of horses are going to carry most of the parasite burden. So we really want to target that 80%, or rather that 20% for more intense deworming, but the majority of horses will not need to be dewormed on a regular interval. Interval deworming started back in the day when we were deworming against large strongyles, and we dewormed horses on specific intervals that were convenient, either based on the calendar or maybe based on a shoeing or a farrier visit schedule, something that was convenient and easy for us to remember. What else? Targeted worming is difficult and costly. Well, Not true. In fact, the opposite is probably true. If we do occasional fecal egg counts, we can get an idea of who the high shedders are, and we can actually save money by having to deworm much less frequently. Also, it will allow us to prevent the development of resistance on our farms, and the chemicals that we have will last much longer. There is some level of resistance to every deworming product that there is on the market on the planet. And there is no new classes of dewormer currently in drug development. So preventing the development of resistance is not only not costly, but it's critical for us to be able to have something to use over time to deworm our horses with. What else is on our list? Negative fecal results prove that the horse is parasite free. Well, we've talked a lot about the importance of fecal egg count results, but unfortunately they're not quite the perfect test. Horses do wax and wane in the number of eggs that they release. So a negative fecal egg count doesn't prove that the horse has no worms. But on the other hand, a high fecal egg count does prove that the horse is carrying a high number of parasites. Okay. Deworming at the first frost. Okay. We've talked a lot about weather, climate, high shedders, low shedders, and really deworming at the first frost is not important when it comes to small strongyles. It may have some utility when we're talking about deworming against some of the less important parasites, but we're going to take care of those easily anyway. So deworming at the first frost is not an important part of our deworming protocol. Okay. Deworming using half doses is safer. Well, studies have shown really well that when we give horses dewormers and we kill off large parasite loads, that it really creates very little detectable inflammation of the intestine at all. So deworming at half doses increases the likelihood of getting resistance, decreases the chance that we properly deworm our horse, and really has no advantage to the horse at all. Daily deworming is effective. Another myth about deworming. Daily deworming just gives the horse a very small dose of a dewormer that has a lot of resistance to it. So really that has become and should become a thing of the past. Horses should be confined after deworming. Some people will keep their horses in stalls after deworming them. And really that is something that we don't need to do. When we deworm a horse, we are killing off mature parasite worms. We're not killing eggs, we're killing off those mature worms. So, keeping horses in stalls after they've been dewormed is of no value. Diatomaceous earth. We would all like to think that there's a nice natural product out there that would be effective against worms. And in fact, most of the dewormers that we use have come from natural sources. In fact, all of them have. And a lot of people ask me and ask a lot of other professionals about the use of diatomaceous earth. Is it a nice natural supplement that we can use to control worms? And there have been studies done on this, and the answer is no. Unfortunately, it is very poorly effective against controlling small strongyles. And this has been repeated in a number of studies. How about 5-day deworming protocols? So we'll still hear a little bit about those 5-day deworming protocols, and those 5-day deworming protocols use the benzimidazoles. And remember what we talked about, the benzimidazoles have a lot of drug resistance. So using those 5-day protocols really don't change that amount of drug resistance. So let's summarize things a little bit. We want to target those high shedders. If we target those high shedders, that's 20% of the horses that are releasing 80% of the worms, and we can really control worms really well. We want to target small strongyles because they are the most important parasite of concern. What other parasites do we care about? Well, real quickly we can run down the list. Tapeworms, like we have a nice, beautiful, very gross picture of tapeworms in horses. Large strongyles are easily taken care of. Okay? Bots, easily taken care of while we're taking care of our small strongyles. Migrating parasites, also easily taken care of, especially if we're using any of the macrocytic lactones, ivermectin or moxidectin, which last a good 8 to 12 weeks in the horse. And then lastly, roundworms. Let's go ahead and move ahead to the next slide and show that video of roundworms. So that video shows some individual roundworms from a single foal. And so when it comes to deworming foals, it really is a completely different program than what we've just talked about when it comes to deworming adults. Deworming adults, we are concerned about small strongyles. Deworming foals, we care a lot about ascarids. And so some of those other dewormers, such as the benzimidazoles, may actually have good utility against deworming ascarids in foals. Okay, so summarize everything together. Prevention is our key, whether it's managing pastures, whether it's managing high shedders. We want to take advantage of climate, use those times of years for a more intense deworming when horses are passing more parasite eggs. And again, can't stress enough, target the high shedders, avoid deworming horses that don't need deworming. Thank you very much for your attention, and let me know if there's any questions. Appreciate your time.